I was 22 years old when I told the most powerful man in England that I would not marry him. 7 years later, standing before the iron gates of Ravenswood Manor in the pouring rain, I wondered if that single word had been my salvation or my undoing. The carriage that brought me here had long since disappeared down the muddy road, and I stood alone with my small trunk at my feet, watching the great house loom against the gray October sky. It looked exactly as I remembered it, all dark stone and towering windows, ivy crawling up its eastern wall like fingers trying to pull it back into the earth. I had been inside those walls only once before, on the night of the Midsummer Ball in 1847, when Lord Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenswood, had led me to the rose garden and asked me to become his wife. I could still hear his voice if I closed my eyes, measured, controlled, as cold as the marble statues that lined the garden path. He had not spoken of love or affection or even companionship. He had spoken of alliance, of advantage, of the sensible merging of two respectable families. And when I looked into his gray eyes, searching for some flicker of warmth, some hint that there might be more beneath the surface, I found nothing but winter. So I said no. The scandal that followed was swift and merciless. No woman refused a duke, especially not a woman of my modest standing. My father, who had spent years cultivating the connection that led to that proposal, never forgave me. My mother wept for months, and the doors of polite society, which had only ever been half open to me, slammed shut with a finality that still echoed in my bones. I had spent the years since then in quiet exile, moving from household to household as a companion to elderly widows and sickly aunts, women who needed someone to read to them and fetch their shawls and pretend not to notice when they spoke of me as though I were not in the room. It was a small life, a lonely life. But it was mine, and I had made peace with it. Or so I thought, until the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday, slipped beneath my door at the boarding house where I had been staying between positions. The paper was thick and cream-colored, sealed with black wax bearing an imprint I recognized immediately. The raven with spread wings, the crest of Ravenswood. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, certain that it must be some mistake, some cruel joke orchestrated by fate. But the words inside were clear and businesslike, written in a hand I did not recognize. A tutor was needed at Ravenswood Manor, someone discreet, someone who could begin immediately and ask no questions. The salary offered was generous, far more than I had ever earned in any of my previous positions. And at the bottom, a single sentence that made my heart stop in my chest. His Grace requests that Miss Eleanor Ashford consider this offer personally. I should have burned that letter. I should have thrown it in the fire and walked away and never looked back. But something in those words caught me, held me, would not let me go. He had asked for me by name. After 7 years of silence, after I had humiliated him before all of London society, he had asked for me. I told myself it was the money that made me accept. I told myself it was the security, the chance to build something stable after years of drifting. But standing before those iron gates in the rain, watching the windows of the manor flicker with candlelight, I knew those were lies. I had come because I needed to understand. I needed to know why he had sent for me, why now, why after all this time. The housekeeper who opened the door was a severe woman with iron-gray hair pulled back from a face that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. She introduced herself as Mrs. Blackwood, no relation to the family, and looked me over with the kind of assessment one might give a horse before purchase. "You are smaller than I expected," she said, "and younger. His Grace did not mention that you would be young." "I am nearly 30, I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I do not think that qualifies as young by any reasonable measure." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any warmth. "This way," she said. "I will show you to your quarters. You will meet your charge in the morning." My charge. The letter had said nothing about who I would be tutoring, only that discretion was required. I followed Mrs. Blackwood through the entrance hall, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts of a grander time. The house was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though it were holding its breath. We climbed the main staircase and turned down a corridor I did not remember from my single previous visit. The walls here were bare of ornament, the carpet worn thin in places. This was not the part of the house meant for guests. "The east wing," Mrs. Blackwood said without turning. "You will stay here. Your meals will be brought to your room. You are not to wander the house without permission. You are not to speak to the other servants about your duties. You are not to leave the grounds without informing me first." I stopped walking. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, "what exactly is it that I have agreed to?" She turned then, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her severe features, something that looked almost like pity. "You have agreed to teach a child, Miss Ashford, a child that does not exist." Before I could ask what she meant, she opened a door at the end of the corridor and gestured for me to enter. The room beyond was small but comfortable, with a fire already burning in the grate and a narrow bed made up with clean linens. My trunk had been carried up ahead of me and sat at the foot of the bed, waiting. "Rest tonight," Mrs. Blackwood said. "Tomorrow I will take you to her." Her. So my charge was a girl who did not exist. I wanted to ask more questions, to demand explanations, but Mrs. Blackwood was already closing the door. I heard the click of the latch, and then I was alone. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the window and watched the rain streak down the glass and tried to make sense of what I had walked into. A child who did not exist. A duke who had summoned me by name after 7 years. A house full of secrets and silence. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing my trunk and walking out into the night and never looking back. But something held me there, some stubborn thread of curiosity that had always been my weakness. I had spent 7 years wondering about the man I had rejected. Now, finally, I might have the chance to understand him. Morning came gray and cold, and with it, Mrs. Blackwood. She brought me breakfast on a tray and waited while I dressed in my plainest gown, the dark blue wool I wore for travel. When I was ready, she led me deeper into the east wing, down corridors that grew narrower and darker until I was certain we must be approaching the very heart of the house. She stopped before a door that looked no different from any other. "There is much you do not know," she said quietly. "Much you cannot know yet. But I will tell you this. The child is not to blame for the circumstances of her birth. She has done nothing wrong. Remember that. Miss Ashford." Then she opened the door, and I saw her for the first time. She was sitting on a window seat, a small figure silhouetted against the gray morning light. Her hair was dark and tangled, falling past her shoulders in waves that had not seen a brush in days. Her dress was fine but wrinkled, and she held a worn cloth doll in her arms with the desperate grip of someone clinging to the only thing that was truly hers. But it was her eyes that stopped me. Gray as a winter storm, gray as the sky before snow, gray as the eyes of the man who had stood in the rose garden 7 years ago and asked me to be his wife. "Charlotte," Mrs. Blackwood said, "this is Miss Ashford. She will be your new tutor." The child did not move, did not speak. She simply looked at me with those impossible eyes, and I felt something shift in my chest, some wall I had built long ago beginning to crack. "Hello, Charlotte," I said softly. I knelt down so that I was at her level, ignoring the protests of my knees against the cold floor. "That is a very beautiful doll. Does she have a name?" For a long moment the child said nothing. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she whispered, "Her name is Rose. My mother gave her to me. Before she went away." I felt my throat tighten. "And where did your mother go?" Those gray eyes met mine, and in them I saw a grief too vast for such a small person to hold. "She went to heaven," Charlotte said, A long time ago. Papa says I must not speak of her." Mrs. Blackwood made a small sound behind me, something between a warning and a plea, but I did not look away from the child. "I think," I said carefully, "that we can speak of whatever you wish. That is what tutors are for." And for the first time, something flickered across that small, solemn face. Not quite a smile, but something close. I did not see the Duke that first day, or the second, or the third. I was told he was occupied with business in London and would return when he returned. In the meantime, I devoted myself to Charlotte. She was 5 years old and had never set foot outside the east wing of the house. She could not read beyond the simplest words. She could not write her own name. She had no friends, no playmates, no one but the servants who brought her meals and Mrs. Blackwood who checked on her each morning and evening. And yet, despite everything, she was not a difficult child. She was quiet and watchful. Yes, slow to trust and quick to withdraw. But when I read to her, she listened with an intensity that broke my heart. When I showed her how to form letters on her slate, she practiced until her fingers cramped. And when I told her stories of the world beyond her window, the parks and the shops and the other children who played in the streets, she drank in every word like someone dying of thirst. I found myself growing fiercely protective of her. This child, who had been hidden away like a shameful secret, who had been denied the simple joys that every child deserved. I did not yet know the full story of her existence, but I knew enough to be angry. It was on the 7th day that I finally saw him. I had taken Charlotte to the library, one of the few rooms in the main house that Mrs. Blackwood had grudgingly permitted us to use. The child was curled up in an armchair by the fire, turning the pages of a picture book I had found on the shelves, when the door opened and he walked in. He was older than I remembered. The 7 years had carved new lines around his mouth and shadowed his eyes with something that looked like exhaustion. His dark hair, once immaculate, was longer now, brushing the collar of his coat. But he was still undeniably, devastatingly handsome in the way of a storm approaching over open water. He stopped when he saw us. His eyes went first to Charlotte, and I watched something pass across his face, something raw and painful and quickly suppressed. Then his gaze found me, and for one endless moment we simply looked at each other. "Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, low and controlled and utterly without warmth. "I trust your accommodations have been satisfactory." "Quite satisfactory, Your Grace," I replied. I stood, smoothing my skirts, trying to remember how to breathe, though I confess I am still uncertain about many aspects of my position here. He glanced at Charlotte again. She had not moved from her chair, but her small body had gone rigid, her eyes fixed on her father with an expression I could not read. "We will discuss the details of your employment tomorrow," the Duke said, "in my study, after breakfast." Then he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him without another word. Charlotte did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. She sat with her book, turning pages she was not reading. And when I tried to engage her in conversation, she answered in single syllables or not at all. It was only when I was tucking her into bed that night that she finally broke her silence. "Miss Ashford," she whispered, "do you think Papa is angry with me?" I brushed a strand of dark hair from her forehead, my heart aching. "What makes you think that?" "He never looks at me," she said. "He never talks to me. He comes to the house, and he walks past my door, and he never comes in. I thought maybe if I was very good, if I was very quiet, he would not be angry anymore. But it does not work. Nothing works." I did not have an answer for her. I did not know how to explain to a 5-year-old that sometimes adults were broken in ways that had nothing to do with the children they loved. So instead, I held her hand and sang to her softly until she fell asleep. And as I walked back to my own room through the dark corridors of Ravenswood Manor, the candle in my hand casting long shadows on the paneled walls, I made a decision. I had come here for answers. I had come here to understand the man who had once asked me to marry him with all the passion of a business transaction, the man whose cold proposal had haunted my dreams for 7 long years. But now there was something more important than my own curiosity, more pressing than the questions that had driven me through those iron gates. There was a child who needed someone to fight for her, a little girl with storm-gray eyes who had been hidden away from the world, who had never felt grass beneath her feet or watched other children play in the sunshine. A daughter whose own father could not bear to look at her, for reasons I did not yet understand, but was determined to discover. I thought of my own childhood, of my mother reading to me by the fire, of my father lifting me onto his shoulders so I could see the ships coming into harbor. Simple moments, ordinary love, the kind of thing that Charlotte had never known and deserved more than anything. The wind howled against the windows as I reached my room, and somewhere in the distance I heard the old house settling, groaning under the weight of its own secrets. I set the candle on my nightstand and looked at my reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin. The face that looked back at me was thinner than it had been 7 years ago, older in ways that had nothing to do with lines or gray hairs. Life had worn me down, polished away the soft edges, until what remained was something harder, something more resilient. I had survived rejection and scandal and years of quiet humiliation. I had learned to expect nothing and want less. But standing in that cold room, thinking of a child crying herself to sleep in a wing of the house that did not officially exist, I felt something kindle in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. Purpose. Tomorrow, I would meet with the Duke. Tomorrow, I would demand answers. And whether Adrian Blackwood, the cold and distant Duke of Ravenswood, liked it or not, I was going to be the one to fight for his daughter. Because someone had to. And after a lifetime of being invisible, of being dismissed and diminished and pushed aside, I had finally found something worth fighting for. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and somewhere in the east wing, a little girl slept with a worn cloth doll clutched to her chest, dreaming of a mother she barely remembered and a father who could not bear to love her. I would change that. I did not know how, and I did not know what it would cost me, but I would change it. That was my promise to Charlotte, and it was a promise I intended to keep. The Duke's study smelled of leather and old paper and something faintly medicinal, like the tinctures my grandmother used to keep in her cabinet. I stood before his desk with my hands clasped in front of me, watching him sign documents with a pen that scratched against the silence like a living thing. He had not looked up when I entered, had not acknowledged my presence beyond a brief gesture toward the chair across from him. I had chosen to remain standing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he set down his pen and raised his eyes to meet mine. In the morning light that streamed through the tall windows, I could see the shadows beneath them more clearly, the evidence of sleepless nights etched into his handsome face. "You have questions," he said. "It was not a question. I have many questions, Your Grace. I believe I am owed answers." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or the ghost of amusement. 7 years ago, you were not so bold. 7 years ago, I was a girl who thought the world would treat her fairly if she followed its rules. I learned otherwise. He studied me for a long moment, and I forced myself to hold his gaze without flinching. Whatever he saw in my face seemed to satisfy him, because he leaned back in his chair and gestured again to the seat across from him. "Sit," he said. "This will take some time." I sat. "Charlotte," he began, and I watched his jaw tighten around the name as though speaking it caused him physical pain. "Charlotte is my daughter. Her mother was a woman named Lily Weston. She was the daughter of a vicar in the village near my country estate. I met her when I was 24 years old, 2 years after you refused my proposal." I said nothing. I simply waited. "She was nothing like the women I had been raised to pursue," he continued. "She was not wealthy or well-connected or trained in the arts of conversation and flattery. She was kind. She was honest. She laughed at things that actually amused her rather than things that were expected to amuse her. And she looked at me as though I were simply a man, not a title or an estate or a means to social advancement. His voice had changed as he spoke, losing some of its cold formality. There was something almost tender in it now, something that hurt to hear. "I loved her," he said quietly. "I know that may seem impossible to you, given what you know of me. But I loved her with everything I had. And when she told me she was carrying my child, I was happier than I had ever been in my life." "Then what happened?" I asked. "Why is Charlotte hidden away? Why does she live like a prisoner in her own home?" The tenderness vanished from his face, replaced by something hard and bitter. "My mother happened," he said. "The Dowager Duchess. She discovered the affair before I could arrange a marriage. She went to Lily's father and told him that his daughter had been ruined by a nobleman who would never marry her, that the child she carried would be a bastard with no claim to the Blackwood name. The vicar, who was a proud and pious man, threw Lily out of his home. She had nowhere to go. No money, no protection. By the time I learned what had happened, she had been living in a boarding house in London for 3 weeks. I felt my stomach turn. "Your mother did this?" "My mother has spent her entire life protecting the Blackwood legacy," he replied. "She would burn the world to ashes if she thought it would preserve our family's reputation." He stood and walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid beneath his dark coat. "I brought Lily here," he continued. "I installed her in the East Wing and told the servants she was a distant cousin in need of rest. I planned to marry her as soon as I could arrange it quietly, without my mother's interference. But Lily was fragile. The stress of everything she had endured, the pregnancy, the journey here, she gave birth too early. The baby survived. She did not. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with grief that had not diminished in 5 years. "I am sorry," I said softly. I did not know what else to say. He turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Charlotte has her mother's face," he said. "Every time I look at her, I see Lily. I see what I lost. I see what my cowardice and my mother's cruelty cost us all, and I cannot bear it." "So you hide her," I said. "You keep her locked away in a wing of the house where no one can see her, where she cannot remind you of your pain." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "Do you understand how cruel that is?" I asked. "Not to you, to her. She is 5 years old, and she believes her father hates her. She believes she has done something wrong, something unforgivable, and that is why you cannot love her." He flinched as though I had struck him. "I do love her," he said. "I love her more than my own life." "Then show her," I replied. "Show her every day, in every way you can. Because right now, Your Grace, she is drowning in loneliness and confusion, and all she wants is for her father to look at her without turning away." He stood very still for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression. The walls he had built around himself, the cold armor he wore against the world, seemed to crack just slightly. "That is why I sent for you," he said finally. "When my mother suggested I hire a proper governess from London, someone who could be trusted to keep Charlotte hidden and ask no questions, I remembered you. I remembered the woman who looked me in the eye and told me no when every other woman in England would have said yes. I thought perhaps you might be brave enough to tell me the truth. And what truth is that? That I am failing my daughter, that I am failing Lily's memory, that I have been so consumed by my own grief that I have forgotten how to be a father." I rose from my chair and walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away, close enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threads beginning to appear in his dark hair. "It is not too late," I said. "Charlotte is still young. She still loves you despite everything. But you must act now, before the damage becomes irreparable." "What would you have me do?" "Spend time with her," I replied. "Read to her. Take her for walks in the garden. Let her see that you are not the cold, distant figure she imagines you to be. And for heaven's sake, stop hiding her. She is your daughter. She deserves to exist." He was quiet for so long that I thought he would not answer. Then, very slowly, he nodded. "You are right," he said. "You have been right about me from the beginning, Miss Ashford. 7 years ago you saw through me when no one else could. You knew I was incapable of love, and you refused to bind yourself to a man who would only make you miserable." "I did not think you were incapable of love," I said quietly. "I thought you were afraid of it. There is a difference." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt something pass between us that I could not name. Something that made my heart beat faster in my chest. "Perhaps you were right about that too," he said. "The days that followed were difficult, but they were also filled with small victories that gave me hope. I convinced the Duke to take his first meal with Charlotte in the nursery, a simple breakfast of toast and eggs that the child approached with the wariness of an animal expecting a trap. But when her father asked her about the picture book she had been reading, when he listened to her halting description of the illustrations with something approaching genuine interest, I saw the ice begin to thaw. It was not a miraculous transformation. There were still moments when he withdrew, when the pain of looking at his daughter became too much and he retreated to his study for hours at a time. There were still nights when Charlotte cried in her sleep, calling out for a mother she barely remembered. But slowly, imperceptibly, things began to change. I took Charlotte outside for the first time on a crisp November morning, wrapped in a heavy cloak that Mrs. Blackwood had produced from some forgotten closet. The child stood at the edge of the garden and stared at the bare trees and brown grass as though she had never seen anything so beautiful. "Miss Ashford," she whispered, "is this what the world looks like?" "This is just one small corner of it," I told her. "There is so much more to see. Will you show me? Will you show me all of it?" I knelt down beside her and took her small hand in mine. "I will show you as much as I can," I promised. "And someday, when you are older, you will see the rest for yourself." She smiled at me then, a real smile that transformed her solemn little face into something radiant. "I am glad you came here," she said. "I prayed for someone like you. I prayed every night. And now you are here." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "I am glad I came too," I said. And I realized, with a certainty that surprised me, that it was true. The Dowager Duchess arrived without warning on a Thursday afternoon, her carriage sweeping up the drive with all the inevitability of a gathering storm. I was in the library with Charlotte when Mrs. Blackwood burst through the door, her face pale with alarm. "She is here," the housekeeper said. "Lady Blackwood. She must not see the child." Before I could respond, she had scooped Charlotte into her arms and hurried toward the servants' staircase. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. We made it to the east wing, just as I heard the front door open and a sharp, imperious voice echo through the entrance hall. "Adrian." "I have come to discuss this absurd rumor I have heard about you hiring a new governess. You know perfectly well that I arranged for Miss Pemberton to take the position. She is discreet and comes highly recommended." I pressed myself against the wall of the corridor, listening. "Miss Pemberton was not suitable," the Duke replied. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "I have made other arrangements." "Other arrangements? Do you mean to tell me that you have hired someone without my approval? Someone who may not understand the delicacy of our situation?" "The situation, as you call it, is my daughter, and I will raise her as I see fit." There was a long pause. When the Dowager spoke again, her voice was ice. "That child is a stain on this family's honor. The longer she remains in this house, the greater the risk that someone will discover her existence. If you had any sense, you would have sent her away years ago. I will never send her away. She is my daughter and Lily's daughter, and she will remain where she belongs." "Lily." The Dowager's voice dripped with contempt. That common little creature who trapped you with her wiles and her tears. I warned you, Adrian. I warned you what would happen if you allowed yourself to be seduced by a woman beneath your station. You warned me, the Duke said quietly, and then you destroyed her. You broke her spirit and drove her from her home and set in motion the events that led to her death. Do not speak to me of warnings. Mother, your hands are stained with blood that will never wash clean. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood in the shadows of the east wing, my hand pressed to my mouth, and felt the world shift beneath my feet. I had known that the Dowager was responsible for Lily's suffering, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the raw anguish in the Duke's voice, made it horrifyingly real. "This is not over," the Dowager said finally. "You may think you can defy me, Adrian, but I have protected this family for longer than you have been alive. I will not allow you to destroy everything I have built." "Then we are at an impasse," the Duke replied, "because I will not allow you to destroy my daughter." I heard footsteps, the sharp click of heels against marble, and then the front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows. I found Charlotte sitting on her bed, her cloth doll clutched to her chest, her gray eyes wide with fear. "Who was that lady?" she asked. "Why was she so angry?" I sat down beside her and gathered her into my arms, holding her close. "She is no one you need to worry about," I said. "Your father will protect you, and so will I." But even as I spoke the words, I felt a chill run down my spine. The Dowager Duchess was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat. Whatever she was planning, whatever she intended to do, I knew with terrible certainty that the battle for Charlotte's future had only just begun. And I knew with equal certainty that I would fight it with everything I had. Because somewhere along the way, this lonely little girl had become more than just my charge. She had become the daughter of my heart. That night, after Charlotte had fallen asleep with her doll tucked under her chin and the fire burning low in the grate, I found myself wandering the corridors of the East Wing. I could not sleep. The Dowager's words echoed in my mind, her voice sharp as broken glass, and I could not shake the feeling that something dark was gathering on the horizon. I paused before a window that overlooked the garden, watching the moonlight cast silver shadows across the dormant flower beds. Lily had walked these paths once. Lily had stood at these windows and looked out at this same view, carrying within her the child who now slept peacefully in the room behind me. What had she felt in those final months? Had she known happiness here, despite everything? Or had the weight of her circumstances crushed her spirit long before her body failed? I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find the Duke approaching through the darkness. He carried no candle, navigating by the faint light that filtered through the windows, and his face was half in shadow. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you," I replied. He came to stand beside me at the window, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence against the chill of the November night. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "My mother will not rest until she has had her way," he said finally. "She never does. Then we must be more stubborn than she is." He turned to look at me, and in the pale moonlight, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. "Why do you care so much?" he asked. "About Charlotte? About any of this? You came here expecting employment, nothing more. You could leave tomorrow and find another position, one without complications or danger. Why do you stay?" I considered his question carefully before answering. "Because I know what it is to be abandoned," I said, "to be cast aside by the people who should have protected you. When I refused your proposal, my family turned their backs on me. I spent years wondering if I had made the right choice, wondering if I should have sacrificed my principles for security and acceptance. And now I look at Charlotte, and I see a child who has done nothing wrong, who has committed no sin except being born, and I cannot walk away from her. I cannot let her grow up believing she is worthless." The Duke was silent for a long time. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Ashford," he said at last. "I did not see it 7 years ago. I was too blind, too wrapped up in my own expectations of what a wife should be, but I see it now. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm against my cold skin. "Whatever comes next," he said, "I want you to know that I am grateful you are here. Charlotte is grateful. And I will do whatever it takes to keep you both safe." I looked down at our joined hands, my heart beating wildly in my chest. "Then we will face the Dowager together," I said, "and we will win." He squeezed my hand gently before releasing it. "Together," he agreed. And as he walked away into the darkness, I stood at the window and watched the moon trace its slow arc across the sky, and I allowed myself to hope that perhaps, against all odds, things might turn out all right after all. But hope, I had learned, was a fragile thing, and the storm that was coming would test us all. The weeks that followed were the happiest I had known since childhood. Charlotte blossomed under our attention like a flower finally given sunlight, and I watched her transform from a withdrawn, frightened creature into something approaching a normal little girl. She learned to read with an eagerness that astonished me, devouring every book I brought her from the library and demanding more. She learned to write her name in careful, deliberate letters, and then her father's name, and then mine. She learned to laugh without covering her mouth, to run through the garden without looking over her shoulder, to believe that the world might not be entirely made of shadows and secrets. And the Duke changed too. I saw it in the way he began to seek out Charlotte's company, appearing in the nursery at unexpected hours with a book under his arm or a question about her lessons. I saw it in the way he knelt beside her in the garden, teaching her the names of the winter birds that came to feed at the stone bird bath. I saw it in the way he looked at her now, not with the anguished avoidance of before, but with something that grew closer to joy with each passing day. He was learning to see past his grief. He was learning to see his daughter. But there were other changes too, changes I was less certain how to interpret. I began to notice his eyes following me across rooms. I began to notice the way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me a book or a cup of tea, the contact brief but deliberate. I began to notice the conversations that stretched longer than they needed to, the excuses he found to seek me out, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that whatever I thought I saw was merely gratitude, the natural warmth that developed between two people working toward a common goal. But late at night, alone in my narrow bed in the East Wing, I could not stop thinking about the way he had held my hand in the moonlight, the way he had called me remarkable, the way his gray eyes had looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. I had spent 7 years convincing myself that I did not regret refusing him. Now I was no longer certain that was true. December came with frost on the windows and a letter from the Dowager Duchess. The Duke read it at breakfast, his face growing darker with each line, and when he finished, he crumpled it in his fist and threw it into the fire. "What does she want?" I asked. "She has invited me to her Christmas ball," he said. His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "She knows I never attend her social functions. She knows I despise the shallow gossip and political maneuvering that passes for entertainment among her set. But she has phrased the invitation in such a way that refusing would be seen as a public insult." "Then you must go," I said. He looked at me sharply. "You think I should dance attendance on the woman who destroyed Lily? Who would destroy Charlotte if she had the chance?" "I think you should know your enemy," I replied. "I think you should show her that you are not afraid, and I think you should discover what she is planning, because she is certainly planning something." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "You are right," he said finally. "As usual. But I will not go alone." I blinked. "Your Grace, you will come with me, Eleanor." He turned to face me, and there was something in his expression that made my pulse quicken. "As my guest, I cannot possibly attend a society ball," I said. "I have not been received in polite company for 7 years. My presence would cause a scandal." "Let them talk," he said. Let them whisper and speculate and draw their own conclusions. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of pretending. If my mother wants a confrontation, then by God she will have one. I stared at him, uncertain whether to be terrified or exhilarated. And Charlotte? I asked. Who will look after her while we are gone? Mrs. Blackwood will stay with her. She has proven herself trustworthy over the years, and Charlotte is comfortable with her. We will only be gone for one night. I thought of the Dowager's sharp eyes and sharper tongue. I thought of the society matrons who had once whispered about me behind their fans, who had celebrated my downfall with barely concealed delight. I thought of all the reasons this was a terrible idea. And then I thought of Charlotte and the future that awaited her if we did not find a way to neutralize the Dowager's influence. Very well, I said. I will come. The Duke smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face and made him look almost young again. Thank you, Eleanor, he said. You are braver than you know. I was not brave. I was terrified, but I had made a promise to a little girl with gray eyes, and I intended to keep it no matter the cost. The gown arrived 3 days before the ball, delivered in a plain brown box with no return address. When I opened it, I found silk the color of midnight, trimmed with silver embroidery that caught the light like stars scattered across a winter sky. There was no note, but I knew who had sent it. I tried to refuse. I went to the Duke's study and told him that I could not accept such an extravagant gift, that it was inappropriate, that people would talk. He looked at me with those gray eyes that were so like his daughter's, and he said, "Let them talk." It was becoming his refrain. The night of the ball, I stood before the mirror in my room and hardly recognized the woman who looked back at me. The gown fit as though it had been made for my body, hugging my waist and flowing to the floor in waves of midnight silk. Mrs. Blackwood had helped me arrange my hair, pinning it up with a spray of silver that matched the embroidery on my dress, and for the first time in years, I looked like someone who belonged in a ballroom. I looked like someone who deserved to be seen. The Duke was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in black evening clothes that made his dark hair and gray eyes all the more striking. When he saw me descending toward him, he went very still. "You are beautiful," he said quietly. "I always knew you would be, if you ever allowed yourself to shine." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Your Grace," I began. "Adrian," he corrected. "Tonight, at least, call me Adrian." "Adrian," I repeated, and the name felt strange on my tongue, intimate in a way that made my heart race. He offered me his arm, and together we walked out into the cold December night, toward the carriage that would carry us to the Dowager's lair. The ball was everything I had expected and feared. The Dowager's townhouse blazed with light, every window glowing with the warm flicker of hundreds of candles. Carriages lined the street, disgorging passengers in silks and satins and jewels that caught the firelight like captured flames. The sound of music and laughter spilled out into the night air, and I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety. "I should not be here," I whispered. "You belong here as much as anyone," Adrian replied, "more than most." We ascended the steps together, his hand warm on my arm, and entered the glittering chaos of high society. I felt the stares immediately. The whispers began before we had taken 3 steps into the ballroom, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. I heard my name murmured in tones of shock and speculation, and I forced myself to keep my chin high and my expression calm. Adrian led me through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had been born to this world, introducing me to acquaintances and ignoring the pointed questions about our relationship with practiced ease. He fetched me champagne and stayed close by my side, a shield against the curious and the cruel. And then the Dowager found us. She materialized from the crowd like a specter, dressed in black lace that made her silver hair gleam like moonlight on ice. Her eyes, the same gray as her son's, but infinitely colder, fixed on me with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Adrian," she said. "How delightful that you decided to attend after all. And you have brought a guest. How unexpected." "Mother," Adrian replied. His voice was pleasant, but I could feel the tension in his arm. "You remember Miss Ashford." "Of course I remember Miss Ashford." The Dowager's smile did not reach her eyes. "The woman who refused your proposal and caused such a delicious scandal. I had wondered what had become of you, my dear. Rumor had it you had fallen quite low." "Rumors are often exaggerated," I said. I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I am doing quite well, as you can see." "Indeed." The Dowager's gaze traveled slowly over my gown, my hair, the silver that adorned me. "Quite well indeed. One might almost think you had found yourself a new patron." The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. I felt Adrian stiffen beside me, but before he could speak, I responded. "One might think many things," I said calmly. "But then, one might also recall that assumptions often say more about the person making them than about the subject being discussed." The Dowager's eyes narrowed. She was not accustomed to being challenged, especially not by women she considered beneath her. "You have developed quite a sharp tongue since last we met," she said. "I have developed many things," I replied, "including a clearer understanding of who deserves my courtesy and who does not." For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, and I felt the weight of everything that had passed between our families, all the pain and destruction this woman had caused. She had broken Lily. She had tried to destroy Charlotte, and now she stood before me, wrapped in her wealth and her cruelty, expecting me to cower. I would not give her the satisfaction. "If you will excuse us, Mother," Adrian said. "Eleanor has promised me the next dance." He led me away before the Dowager could respond, guiding me onto the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz. I felt his hand settle at my waist, felt the warmth of his body close to mine, and for a moment I forgot where we were and why we had come. "That was magnificent," he murmured as we began to move. "I have never seen anyone stand up to her like that." "Someone needed to," I replied. "She has terrorized everyone around her for far too long." He smiled down at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made my breath catch. "You are extraordinary, Eleanor," he said. "I did not deserve you 7 years ago. I am not certain I deserve you now, but I find myself hoping nonetheless." The music swelled around us, and for one perfect moment, the rest of the world fell away. There was only the warmth of his hand on my waist, the gray of his eyes looking into mine, the feeling of something fragile and precious beginning to bloom between us. And then, the moment shattered. A commotion at the edge of the ballroom caught our attention, raised voices cutting through the music. We stopped dancing, turning toward the sound, and I saw a footman pushing through the crowd toward us, his face pale with urgency. "Your Grace," the footman gasped, "you must come at once. There has been an incident at Ravenswood. The child." My blood turned to ice. "Charlotte." We did not wait for explanations. We did not offer farewells to our hostess or collect our cloaks from the servants. We simply ran, Adrian's hand gripping mine, through the glittering ballroom and out into the cold December night, where our carriage waited like salvation in the darkness. "What happened?" Adrian demanded as we climbed inside. "Tell me everything." The footman's voice shook. "The Dowager's men, Your Grace. They came while you were away. Mrs. Blackwood tried to stop them, but there were too many. They have taken the child." The carriage lurched forward, and Adrian's face went white. "My mother," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "She planned this. The ball, the invitation, all of it. She wanted us away from the house. I felt sick with horror and rage. She would not dare harm Charlotte," I said. "Not her own grandchild." "You do not know her," Adrian replied. His eyes were wild with fear. "She would do anything to protect the family name. Anything." "Then we will get Charlotte back," I said. I gripped his hand, trying to pour all my strength into him. We will find her, and we will bring her home, and we will make certain your mother can never touch her again." He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw not just fear, but something else. Something that looked like love. "Promise me," he said. "I promise," I replied. And as the carriage raced through the night toward an uncertain future, I knew that I would keep that promise or die trying. Because Charlotte was not just his daughter anymore. She was mine too, and I would burn the world to ashes before I let anyone take her from us. The journey back to Ravenswood seemed to last forever. Every bump in the road, every moment of delay felt like an eternity of torment. I sat across from Adrian in the darkness of the carriage, watching the moonlight play across his anguished features, and I felt my heart break for him all over again. He had already lost Lily. He had already lived through the worst grief a man could know, watching the woman he loved slip away while their child drew her first breath. To lose Charlotte now, after everything, after he had finally begun to open his heart again, would destroy him utterly. I would not let that happen. "Where would she take her?" I asked. "If your mother wanted to hide Charlotte, where would she go?" Adrian shook his head. "She has properties throughout England, a house in Bath, an estate in Yorkshire, connections who would shelter her without asking questions. Charlotte could be anywhere." "Then we will search everywhere," I said. "We will tear apart every house and every estate until we find her. We will not stop until she is safe." He reached across the darkness and took my hand, holding it as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was rough with emotion. "Whatever happens tonight, whatever comes next, I need you to know something. I need you to know that I love you." The words hung between us in the cold air, and I felt tears spring to my eyes. "Adrian," I whispered. "I have loved you since the moment you refused me in that rose garden," he continued. "I was too proud to see it then, too blind to understand what I had lost. But these past months, watching you with Charlotte, watching you fight for her with everything you have, I have finally understood. You are the woman I should have been worthy of all along. And I swear to you, if we get through this night, I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." I squeezed his hand, my heart so full I thought it might burst. "We will get through this night," I said, "and you already deserve more than you know." The carriage thundered on through the darkness, carrying us toward home, toward danger, toward the fight of our lives. And somewhere in the night, a little girl with gray eyes was waiting to be rescued. We were coming for her, and heaven help anyone who stood in our way. We arrived at Ravenswood to find chaos. Servants rushed through the corridors with lanterns, their faces drawn with fear. Mrs. Blackwood sat in the entrance hall with a cloth pressed to her forehead, blood seeping through the fabric where one of the intruders had struck her. She fought like a lioness, a young maid told us, her voice trembling. She would not let them take the child without a struggle, but there were 4 of them, Your Grace. 4 men, and they had orders. Adrian knelt beside the housekeeper, his face ashen. "Mrs. Blackwood, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, and I saw fierce determination burning through the pain. "They took her to the old Dower house," she whispered, "the one on the Yorkshire property. I heard them talking when they thought I was unconscious. The Dowager plans to keep her there until arrangements can be made." "What arrangements?" Adrian demanded. Mrs. Blackwood's face twisted with anguish. "She means to send the child away, Your Grace, across the sea, to a family in America, who will raise her as their own and never speak of her origins. She said it was the only way to protect the family name." I felt the blood drain from my face. She means to steal Charlotte completely, to erase her existence as though she had never been born. Adrian rose to his feet, and I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. It was not just anger. It was the cold, terrible fury of a man who had finally reached the end of his endurance. "How long ago did they leave?" he asked. 2 hours, perhaps 3, Mrs. Blackwood replied. They have a considerable head start. Then we must move quickly. Adrian turned to me, his gray eyes burning with purpose. Eleanor, I will not ask you to come with me. This could be dangerous. My mother is desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. I stepped forward and took his hand. You are not asking, I said. I am telling you that I am coming. Charlotte needs both of us, and I will not sit here waiting while you ride into danger alone. For a moment, I thought he might argue. Then something softened in his face, and he nodded. Together, then, he said, as it should be. We rode through the night, changing horses at posting inns along the road, pushing northward with a speed that left me aching in every muscle. The December cold bit through my borrowed traveling cloak, and my fine ball gown was soon ruined beyond repair. But I did not care. All that mattered was reaching Charlotte before it was too late. Adrian told me about the Dowager house as we rode. It had belonged to his grandmother, a woman as cold and calculating as her daughter, and had stood empty for years since her death. It was isolated, surrounded by moorland, and accessible only by a single narrow road. The perfect place to hide a child no one was supposed to know existed. My mother has planned this for months, he said grimly. Perhaps years. She was only waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, and I handed it to her on a silver platter. You could not have known, I said. You trusted that she would not go this far. I should never have trusted her at all. He urged his horse faster, his jaw set with determination. I knew what she was capable of. I saw what she did to Lily. But I told myself that Charlotte was her grandchild, that surely even she would not harm her own blood. I was a fool. You were hopeful, I corrected him. There is no shame in hoping for the best in people, even when they have given you reason to expect the worst. He glanced at me, and even in the darkness, I could see the gratitude in his eyes. How do you do that? He asked. How do you find light in even the darkest moments? I have spent 7 years in darkness, I replied. I have learned to look for light wherever I can find it. Otherwise, the shadows would have swallowed me whole. We rode on in silence after that, but his hand found mine across the space between our horses, and we held on to each other as the miles disappeared beneath us. Dawn was breaking over the Yorkshire moors when we finally saw the Dowager house. It rose from the landscape like a gray ghost, its windows dark, its chimneys cold. A single carriage stood in the drive, and I felt my heart leap with desperate hope. They are still here, I breathed. Adrian dismounted and helped me down, his hands lingering on my waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Stay behind me, he said quietly. If anything happens, if there is any danger, you must promise me you will run. I will make no such promise, I replied. We face this together, or not at all. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, to my surprise, he smiled. I should have known better than to argue with you, he said. Yes, I agreed. You should have. We approached the house cautiously, keeping to the shadows of the overgrown garden. The front door was locked, but Adrian led me around to a servant's entrance at the back, one he remembered from childhood visits. The lock was old and rusted, and it gave way with minimal effort. Inside, the house smelled of dust and neglect, and something else, something sharp that I recognized as fear. We moved through the darkened corridors as quietly as we could, listening for any sound that might tell us where Charlotte was being held. We found her in the nursery. It was a room that had not been used in decades, its furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts of a happier time. Charlotte sat in the corner, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face streaked with tears. When she saw us, she let out a cry that shattered my heart. Papa, Miss Ashford, you came for me. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides and swept her into his arms, holding her so tightly I thought he might never let go. Of course we came for you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. We will always come for you. Always. I knelt beside them, stroking Charlotte's tangled hair, checking her for injuries. She seemed unharmed, merely frightened and exhausted, and I felt tears of relief sliding down my own cheeks. "The bad men brought me here," Charlotte whispered. "They said I had to go away. They said I could never see you again." "They were wrong," I told her fiercely. "You are never going anywhere. You are staying with us, where you belong." How touching. The voice came from the doorway, and we all turned to find the Dowager Duchess standing there. Her silver hair perfectly arranged, her black dress immaculate despite the hour. Behind her stood two men with the look of hired muscle, their faces hard and expressionless. "I wondered how long it would take you to find us," the Dowager said. "You are faster than I anticipated. No matter. The ship does not sail until tomorrow evening. There is still time to complete our arrangements." Adrian rose to his feet, positioning himself between his mother and Charlotte. "There will be no arrangements," he said. "Charlotte is my daughter. She is coming home with me. Your daughter." The Dowager's voice dripped with contempt. "That creature is the product of your weakness, Adrian. Your pathetic infatuation with a common village girl who spread her legs for a title she could never have. She is a stain on everything our family has built for generations." "She is a child," I said, stepping forward despite my fear. "An innocent child who has done nothing wrong. Whatever hatred you feel for her mother, whatever shame you believe she represents, none of it is her fault." The Dowager turned her cold gaze on me. "Ah, yes, the governess who fancies herself a duchess. Did you think I would not see through your little scheme, Miss Ashford? Did you think I would stand by while you wormed your way into my son's affections and his bed?" "My relationship with your son is none of your concern," I replied steadily. "What concerns me is the safety of a little girl who deserves far better than she has received from her own grandmother." Something flickered in the Dowager's eyes. Something that might have been surprise or perhaps grudging respect. "You have spirit," she said. "I will give you that. More spirit than I expected from a woman who has spent 7 years in disgrace. But spirit alone will not save you. Nothing will save you." She gestured to the men behind her. "Take the child," she commanded, "and remove these two from my sight." The men moved forward, and I felt Adrian tense beside me, preparing to fight. But before either of us could act, another voice rang out from somewhere deeper in the house. "I would not do that if I were you." A man stepped into the corridor behind the Dowager, a man I did not recognize at first. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. He wore the simple clothes of a country gentleman, but he carried himself with an authority that made the hired men hesitate. The Dowager spun to face him, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw fear flicker across her features. "William," she breathed, "what are you doing here?" "I came because Mrs. Blackwood sent word of what you had done," the man replied. His voice was calm but hard as iron. "She has been sending me word for years, Margaret. Every cruelty, every manipulation, every scheme you have devised to control our son and hide his child from the world. I have records of everything." The Dowager went pale. "You would not dare." "I would dare anything to protect my granddaughter," the man said. He looked past her to where Charlotte huddled against Adrian's chest, and his expression softened. "Hello, little one. I am your grandfather. I am sorry it has taken me so long to meet you." Adrian stared at his father with an expression of disbelief. "You knew," he said. "All this time, you knew about Charlotte?" "I knew," Lord Blackwood confirmed, "and I am ashamed that I did not act sooner. I allowed your mother to convince me that staying silent was best for everyone, that interfering would only make things worse. But I was wrong. I was a coward, and I intend to make amends." He turned back to the Dowager, and his voice hardened. "Here is what will happen, Margaret. You will release our son and his daughter and Miss Ashford without further interference. You will return to London and never again attempt to contact Charlotte or influence her upbringing. And you will do all of this quietly, without scandal, because if you do not, I will make public every shameful secret you have ever kept, including the truth about what happened to Lily Weston." The Dowager's face contorted with rage. "You would destroy this family," she hissed. "You would drag the Blackwood name through the mud." "I would save this family," Lord Blackwood replied, "something you have never understood how to do." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the Dowager stepped aside. "This is not over," she said to Adrian. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the hatred in it was unmistakable. "Yes, Mother," Adrian replied quietly. "It is." He walked past her without another glance, Charlotte still cradled in his arms. I followed close behind, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Lord Blackwood fell into step beside us as we made our way out of that cursed house. "I have a carriage waiting," he said. "It will take you back to Ravenswood. I will follow in a few days, after I have ensured that Margaret understands the consequences of further interference." Adrian paused, looking at his father with an expression I could not quite read. "Why now?" he asked. "After all these years, why act now?" Lord Blackwood's gaze moved to me, and then to Charlotte, and finally back to his son. "Because I watched you walk into that ballroom last night with a woman who clearly loves you," he said. "A woman brave enough to face down your mother in front of all of London society. And I realized that you had finally found what I was never strong enough to give you. A family worth fighting for." He reached out and placed his hand on Adrian's shoulder. "Take care of them, son. Both of them. Do not make my mistakes." Then he turned and walked back toward the Dower house, leaving us standing in the pale December dawn. Adrian looked at me, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears. "Eleanor," he said softly. I stepped closer and laid my hand against his cheek. "Let us go home," I said. And together, with Charlotte safe between us, we walked toward the waiting carriage and the promise of a new beginning. The journey back to Ravenswood was nothing like the frantic ride that had brought us north. We traveled slowly, stopping frequently to rest and eat, giving Charlotte time to recover from her ordeal. She slept for most of the first day, curled up on the carriage seat with her head in my lap and her small hand clutching her father's fingers. I watched her sleep and marveled at her resilience. She had been through so much in her short life, abandoned by circumstance, hidden away by shame, and now kidnapped by her own grandmother. And yet, even now, there was a peace in her face that gave me hope. Children were stronger than we gave them credit for. They could survive almost anything, as long as they knew they were loved. Adrian sat across from us, his eyes rarely leaving his daughter's face. The lines of tension that had marked his features for so long were beginning to soften, replaced by something that looked almost like serenity. "I have wasted so much time," he said quietly, as the countryside rolled past our windows. "So many years when I could have been her father, truly her father, instead of a ghost who haunted the edges of her life." "You cannot change the past," I replied. "You can only shape the future. And Charlotte's future looks brighter than it ever has before." He reached across the carriage and took my hand. "Because of you," he said. "None of this would have happened without you, Eleanor. You woke me from a nightmare I did not even know I was living. You showed me that there was still hope, still love, still a reason to fight. I do not know how I will ever repay you." I looked down at the sleeping child in my lap, at the man who sat across from me with his heart in his eyes, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the winter sun streaming through the carriage windows. "You already have," I said. On the second night, we stopped at a small inn near the border of Yorkshire. Charlotte was awake by then, chattering happily about the horses and the snow that had begun to fall, and the hot chocolate the innkeeper's wife had prepared for her. She seemed to have put the events of the past days behind her, with the miraculous adaptability of childhood, focusing instead on the adventure of the journey and the novelty of staying at a real inn. After she had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed, Adrian found me sitting by the fire in the small private parlor the innkeeper had provided. He carried 2 glasses of wine and offered one to me before settling into the chair beside mine. "She asked me something today," he said, "while you were resting." "What did she ask?" He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "She asked if you were going to be her new mother." I felt my breath catch. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I did not know," he replied, "that I hoped so, but that it was not my decision alone to make, that you would have to agree." He turned to face me, and in the firelight his gray eyes were warm and open in a way I had never seen before. "I know this is not the time or the place," he said. "I know that we have been through more in the past few days than most people experience in a lifetime, but I cannot wait any longer. I cannot pretend that what I feel for you is anything less than it is." He set down his wine and knelt before me, taking both my hands in his. "Eleanor Ashford," he said, "7 years ago, I asked you to marry me with all the coldness of a business transaction. I offered you nothing but my name and my fortune because I did not know that I had anything else to give. You were wise enough to refuse me. You saw what I could not see myself." His voice grew rougher, thick with emotion. "I am asking you again now, but this time I am offering everything. My heart, my soul, my love, for whatever it is worth. I am offering you a daughter who adores you and a life that will not always be easy, but will always be true. I am asking you to build a family with me, Eleanor. A real family, built on love and trust and the courage to face whatever comes together." Tears were streaming down my face, but I made no move to wipe them away. "Adrian," I whispered. "I know I do not deserve you," he continued. "I know that I failed you once before, and that the years since then have not been kind to either of us. But I believe, with everything I am, that we were meant to find our way back to each other. I believe that you were meant to be Charlotte's mother, and I was meant to spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." He lifted my hands to his lips and kissed them gently. "Will you marry me, Eleanor? Not for duty or advantage or the expectations of society, but because I love you, wholly and completely, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." I looked at this man who had once been a stranger, who had become an ally, a friend, and something far more precious than either. I thought of all the years I had spent alone, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. I thought of Charlotte, sleeping peacefully upstairs, dreaming of a future that finally held hope. And I thought of the girl I had been 7 years ago, standing in a moonlit garden, saying no to a proposal that offered her everything except the one thing she needed. "Yes," I said. My voice broke on the word, but I did not care. "Yes, Adrian, I will marry you." He rose and pulled me into his arms, and when he kissed me, it was nothing like I had ever imagined. It was not the cold, formal kiss of a duke claiming his bride. It was the desperate, tender kiss of a man who had been lost in darkness and finally found his way home. "I love you," he murmured against my lips. "I love you, Eleanor. I will spend every day of my life proving it to you." "I know," I whispered back, "and I love you too." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. And in that small inn parlor, wrapped in the arms of the man I loved, I felt something I had not felt in 7 long years. I felt like I had finally come home. We were married on a crisp January morning, in the small chapel that stood at the edge of the Ravenswood estate. The stone walls were ancient and weathered, softened by centuries of prayer and devotion, and through the stained glass windows, winter sunlight fell in patterns of gold and rose across the worn wooden pews. It was not the grand society wedding that a duke was expected to have. There were no hundreds of guests in their finest silks, no elaborate decorations, no orchestra playing beneath crystal chandeliers. There was only family and a handful of trusted friends gathered together to witness the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. Charlotte stood beside me at the altar, wearing a white dress with a blue sash that matched my own gown. She held a small bouquet of winter roses, and her gray eyes shone with a happiness I had once feared she would never know. When the vicar asked who gave this woman to be married, she stepped forward with all the solemnity her 6 years could muster. "I do," she said, "because she is going to be my mother now, and I have been waiting for her my whole life." I heard Adrian's breath catch beside me, and when I glanced at him, I saw tears glistening in his eyes. He took my hand and held it as though he would never let go. The vows we spoke were simple, the ancient words that had bound couples together for generations. But when Adrian slipped the ring onto my finger, when he looked into my eyes and promised to love and cherish me until death parted us, I felt the weight of everything we had overcome pressing against my heart. 7 years ago, I had refused this man because I believed he was incapable of love. Now I knew the truth. He had always been capable of love. He had simply been too wounded, too afraid, too lost in his own grief to show it. It had taken a lonely child and a stubborn governess to crack open the walls he had built around his heart. And now those walls were gone forever. When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, Adrian kissed me with a tenderness that made my knees weak. Charlotte cheered and threw her roses into the air, and the small congregation erupted in applause. Lord Blackwood, who had walked me down the aisle in the absence of my own estranged father, wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and embraced his son with a warmth that spoke of bridges finally mended. Mrs. Blackwood had prepared a wedding breakfast in the great hall, the first time in years that the room had been used for celebration rather than simply existing as another dusty monument to the past. Candles blazed in the chandeliers, fires roared in the massive hearths, and the long table groaned under the weight of food and flowers and joy. I sat at the head of that table with my husband on one side and my daughter on the other, and I marveled at the strange turns life could take. 3 months ago, I had been a disgraced woman with no family, no prospects, and no hope for anything better. Now I was a duchess, a wife, and a mother, surrounded by people who loved me. It was more than I had ever dared to dream. The Dowager Duchess did not attend the wedding. She had retreated to her London townhouse immediately after the confrontation at the Dower House, and had not been seen or heard from since. Lord Blackwood assured us that she understood the consequences of further interference, that the evidence he had gathered over the years was more than enough to destroy her reputation if she ever attempted to harm Charlotte again. I did not know if I believed that her silence would last forever. Women like the Dowager did not surrender easily, but for now, the threat she represented had been neutralized, and I was determined to focus on the future rather than dwelling on fears of what might come. Charlotte's existence was no longer a secret. In the weeks following our return from Yorkshire, Adrian had made a formal declaration acknowledging her as his legitimate heir, a legal maneuver that Lord Blackwood's solicitors had assured us was unassailable. There had been scandal, of course. The gossips of London society had feasted on the story of the Duke's hidden daughter and his marriage to the woman who had once refused him. But the scandal had been smaller than I expected, tempered perhaps by the romantic nature of the tale. A duke who had loved and lost, who had hidden his daughter out of grief rather than shame, who had finally found redemption in the arms of a woman brave enough to fight for both of them. It was the kind of story that people wanted to believe in, even if believing meant setting aside their usual appetite for cruelty. Spring came early that year, painting the gardens of Ravenswood in shades of green and gold. I walked those gardens every morning with Charlotte, teaching her the names of flowers and birds, watching her blossom alongside the crocuses and daffodils. She had changed so much in the months since I first met her. The withdrawn, frightened child who had hidden in the shadows of the east wing was gone, replaced by a bright, curious girl who laughed easily and loved fiercely. She called me Mama now. a word that still made my heart swell with emotion every time I heard it. And she looked at her father, not with the wary confusion of before, but with the uncomplicated adoration of a daughter who knew beyond any doubt that she was loved. Adrian had changed too. The cold, distant duke who had proposed to me in a moonlit garden 7 years ago was a stranger I barely remembered. In his place was a man who read bedtime stories with dramatic voices, who chased his daughter through the corridors until they were both breathless with laughter, who held me in his arms each night and whispered that he could not believe his luck. He told me once that I had saved him, that without me he would have spent the rest of his life drowning in grief and guilt, punishing himself for sins that were never truly his to bear. I told him that he was wrong, that he had saved himself by having the courage to ask for help, by being willing to change. But perhaps we had saved each other. Perhaps that was what love truly meant. On a warm evening in May, I found myself standing at the window of the nursery, watching the sun set over the grounds of my new home. Charlotte was asleep in her bed behind me, exhausted from a day of adventures in the garden. Adrian was somewhere downstairs, dealing with estate business that could not wait. I pressed my hand to my stomach, where a new life was just beginning to grow. I had not told him yet. I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to share the news that would complete our family. But standing there in the golden light of evening, I could not contain my happiness any longer. I went downstairs and found him in his study, bent over papers at his desk. When I entered, he looked up with a smile that still had the power to make my breath catch. "Is Charlotte asleep?" he asked. "Finally," I replied. She wore herself out chasing butterflies. He laughed and pushed back from his desk, opening his arms to me. I crossed the room and settled into his lap, resting my head against his shoulder. "I have something to tell you," I said. He stilled. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect." I took his hand and placed it on my stomach. "We are going to have a child, Adrian. A brother or sister for Charlotte." For a moment, he did not move. Then I felt his hand tremble against my belly, and when I looked up at his face, I saw tears streaming down his cheeks. "Eleanor," he whispered, "are you certain?" "I am certain," I said. "The doctor confirmed it this morning." He pulled me closer, burying his face in my hair, and I felt his shoulders shake with sobs. But they were not tears of grief. They were tears of joy, of overwhelming gratitude, of a man who had been given more than he ever thought he deserved. "I love you," he said against my ear. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I do not know what I did to deserve you, to deserve this life we are building together. But I swear to you, Eleanor, I will spend every moment of every day trying to be worthy of it." I cupped his face in my hands and kissed him softly. "You are already worthy," I said. "You always were. You just needed someone to remind you." We sat together in the fading light, holding each other, dreaming of the future. Outside the window, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house, our daughter slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she was loved. And within me, a new life stirred. The next chapter in a story that had begun with rejection and loneliness, and had blossomed into something more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. I thought of the girl I had been 7 years ago, standing in that moonlit garden, saying no to a proposal that offered her everything except love. I had been called foolish. I had been called proud. I had been shunned and pitied and forgotten by everyone who had once claimed to care for me. But I had been right. I had been right to wait for something real, something true, something worth the years of hardship and solitude. I had been right to believe that love was not a business transaction, that marriage should be a partnership of equals, that a woman deserved more than a cold bed and a title. And now, finally, I had found it. I had found a man who loved me not despite my stubbornness and my pride, but because of them. I had found a daughter who had taught me that motherhood was not about blood, but about choice. I had found a home where I belonged, not as a servant or a companion or a convenient arrangement, but as the heart of a family that had been broken and was now whole. The summer that followed was the happiest of my life. Charlotte greeted the news of her impending sibling with ecstatic joy, spending hours discussing potential names and making elaborate plans for all the games they would play together. Adrian hovered over me with touching concern, insisting that I rest when I was not tired and eat when I was not hungry, until I finally laughed and told him that I was having a baby, not dying of consumption. Lord Blackwood visited often, taking Charlotte on long walks around the estate and telling her stories of her father's childhood. The relationship between father and son, so long strained by the Dowager's manipulations, grew stronger with each passing month. There was still pain there, still regret for the years that had been lost. But there was also hope, and forgiveness, and the determination to do better. The Dowager remained in London, a spectre on the edge of our happiness. We received occasional reports of her activities, her attempts to rebuild her social standing, her carefully worded letters to old allies. But she made no move against us, no attempt to interfere with our lives. Perhaps she had finally accepted defeat. Or perhaps she was simply biding her time, waiting for an opportunity that would never come. I chose not to worry about her. I had spent too many years living in fear, anticipating disasters that might never arrive. Now I had a husband who loved me, a daughter who needed me, and a child growing beneath my heart. I had a future bright with possibility and a past that had taught me the value of everything I now possessed. On a golden September afternoon, I sat in the garden with Charlotte, watching her practice her letters on a small slate. She was learning quickly, my clever girl, already reading simple stories on her own and demanding more complicated ones every day. "Mama," she said, looking up at me with her father's gray eyes, "when the baby comes, will you still love me?" I set aside my embroidery and pulled her into my lap. "I will always love you," I said. "No matter how many brothers or sisters you have, no matter what happens, you will always be my first daughter. The one who made me a mother. Do you understand?" She nodded solemnly. "I understand." She paused, then added, "I am glad you came to Ravenswood, Mama. I am glad you found us." "I am glad too," I said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "More glad than you will ever know." Adrian found us there an hour later, two figures curled together on a garden bench, drowsy in the afternoon warmth. He sat down beside us and took my hand, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. We were a family, imperfect and complicated, and built from the wreckage of grief and loss. But we were together, we were whole, and we were loved. That was enough. That was everything. I was 22 years old when I told the most powerful man in England that I would not marry him. And I was 29 when I finally became his wife, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because he had earned my love and my trust and my forever. It was the best decision I ever made, both times. Years later, when our son was old enough to ask how his parents had met, Charlotte would tell him the story before either of us could speak. She would describe it with all the dramatic flair of a natural storyteller, embellishing the details until Adrian and I were heroic figures from a fairy tale, battling villains and rescuing damsels and finding true love against impossible odds. She was not entirely wrong. Our son, whom we named William after his grandfather, grew up surrounded by love in a house that had once been filled with shadows. He and Charlotte were inseparable, partners in mischief and adventure, united by a bond that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. She protected him fiercely, this little brother who had made their family complete, and he adored her with the unquestioning devotion of a child who had never known anything but happiness. I watched them grow, these children of mine, and I marveled at the strange paths that had led me to them. If I had accepted Adrian's proposal 7 years ago, none of this would exist. Charlotte would have remained hidden in the East Wing, unloved and unknown. William would never have been born, and I would have spent my life married to a man who did not know how to love me, trapped in a gilded cage of my own making. By saying no, I had said yes to everything that truly mattered. The Dowager Duchess passed away in the winter of 1862, alone in her London townhouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had never brought her happiness. Adrian attended the funeral out of duty, but he did not mourn her. Neither did I. Some wounds cut too deep for forgiveness, and the scars she had left on our family would never fully heal. But we did not let her memory poison our joy. We had learned, all of us, that the past could only hurt us if we allowed it to. And we had chosen, together, to look forward instead of back. Lord Blackwood lived to see his grandchildren grow, to hold them on his knee and tell them stories of the old days, to watch his son become the man he had always hoped he would be. When he died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, the entire village turned out for his funeral. He had been a good man in the end, a man who had made mistakes and found the courage to correct them. A man who had chosen love over legacy. I hoped that, when my time came, people would say the same of me. But that time was still far in the future, a distant shore I could not yet see. For now, there was life to be lived. There were children to raise, and gardens to tend, and a husband to love. There were quiet evenings by the fire, and boisterous family dinners, and long walks through the grounds of Ravenswood, hand in hand with the man who had become my whole world. There was Charlotte, who grew into a remarkable young woman, brilliant and compassionate and fearless in ways that made my heart swell with pride. She never forgot those early years in the East Wing, the loneliness and fear that had shaped her childhood. But she transformed that pain into purpose, becoming an advocate for other forgotten children, using her position and her voice to shine light into dark places. She was, in every way that mattered, my greatest achievement. And there was Adrian, my partner, my love, my home, the man who had asked me to marry him twice and meant it completely only the second time. The man who had learned that strength was not the same as coldness, that vulnerability was not weakness, that love required courage above all else. He told me once, on our 20th wedding anniversary, that he fell in love with me the moment I refused him in that moonlit garden. He said that no one had ever looked at him with such clarity, such uncompromising honesty. He said that I had seen through every wall he had built and found him wanting, and that he had spent the rest of his life trying to become the man I deserved. I told him that he was that man, that he had always been that man, that I had simply given him the chance to discover it for himself. We argued about it gently, the way couples do who have been together long enough to know that some disagreements are more about love than conflict. And then we laughed, and he kissed me, and I remembered all over again why I had chosen him, why I would always choose him. This is the story of how I found my family. Not the family I was born into, the one that abandoned me when I dared to want more than they were willing to give. But the family I chose, the family I built, the family that taught me what love truly means. It began with a refusal and ended with an acceptance. It began with a lonely child in a forgotten wing and ended with a house full of laughter and light. It began with two broken people and ended with something whole. I was the only woman who rejected the Duke of Ravenswood, and in rejecting him, I found everything I ever wanted: his daughter, his heart, his hand, and a love that would last forever.